morning, I'm Karima Brown. It's Sunday and it's time for The Fix. First up, we look at where the sport can go where politics can't in terms of building unity in a deeply unequal and racially divided South Africa.
Sport can create hope where once there was only despair.
My expert panel will look at how the tribe must die so that the nation can be born. Now, the killing of an ANC Youth League member and the inability of young people in the organization to play its historical kingmaker role raises the question, does the ANC need a youth league? And if so, what exactly is its role in democratic South Africa? And as is custom, we take a look at what's made headlines in the weekend newspapers and why. The Fix starts now. Welcome to this edition of The Fix, where every Sunday we hold the decision makers to account. We tell you why it matters, how it affects you, and why you should care.
Sport can create hope where once there was only despair. It is more powerful than governments in breaking down racial barriers. It laughs in the face of all types of discrimination.
Now, events in the sporting world, including South Africa winning the Rugby World Cup, have brought together South Africans from many different walks of life, across race, gender and class divisions. Politicians such as former President Nelson Mandela seized upon that outpouring of national pride back in 1995, and we're doing it again now, and looking at the our argument that power of sport can and must be harnessed to build bridges and to highlight the quintessential South Africanness that is often so elusive in the country. But can it really transcend the deep divisions in post-apartheid South Africa? Joining me to discuss this is ANC Veteran Pallo Jordan, author and academic, and also we speak to journalist and broadcaster John Perlman, as well as Luvuyo Madasa from ReImagine South Africa. Gentlemen, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, Pallo Jordan, that powerful clip from Madiba was, of course, taken just after the 1995 World Cup, which South Africa had won. But times have changed. Many have argued that the rainbowism of that period is completely inappropriate now. Do you think that sport can actually go where politics can't in terms of forging social cohesion in society?
Well, there are a number of issues, I think, that we have to address, talking about sport, national cohesion, and the politics of sport. In our case, I think we have to remember that rugby was never really a national sport. Rugby was played predominantly by whites, and then in the old South Africa played only by blacks in the old Cape Province, now Northern Cape, Western Cape, Eastern Cape, which is why there's very rarely any representation of black players from the other provinces. But having said that, we should also remember that before 1994 there was no identification with the Springboks on the part of the majority of South Africans. When I was growing up, when we went to Newlands, we used to cheer whatever overseas team was playing the Springboks because we didn't identify with the Springboks. After 1994, I think people began to identify with the Springboks, beginning with that 95 Rugby World Cup. And since then, I think support for the Springboks has grown in the wider population. The other issue we have to remember also is that in the 20th century, sport and sporting figures were used by the African population internationally for making political statements. You think of Jesse Owen, for instance, at the Berlin Olympics. You think of Joe Louis beating Matt Smalling. You think also of the stand Muhammad Ali took on the issue of the Vietnam War. You take also Kaepernick now, who takes the knee rather than salute the United States national anthem during football games. You think also of the Mexico Olympics and the Black Power salute. So sport has been used in this manner by people of African descent internationally for political statements. The third point we have to remember also is that it's the most popular platform for making such expressions. That Black Power salute in '68 was seen in every part of the world where there was television. Regrettably, there was no television in South Africa in those days, so South Africans didn't see it. But that internationalized the symbol of black unity and black struggle. Equally today, when Kaepernick takes the knee, rather than salute the Star-Spangled Banner, that's a very, very strong statement, and it's seen in every home where they're watching football.
Okay.
So those are the issues I think we have to address.
Absolutely. Now, John, that segues really nicely into what I want to discuss with you. I mean, as a broadcaster and as a sports journalist for a large part of your life, yes, you have gone to places where you wouldn't have ordinarily have gone if it hadn't been for being a journalist and for covering sport. You're also involved with the Dreamfields project, which is, of course, a soccer initiative that takes soccer to townships. How powerful is sport really in dealing with a South Africa that is still 25 years into democracy, divided along class lines, race lines, gender lines, and just access to resources?
Well, I want to come back to the Nelson Mandela quote where he said, sport has a power like no other. As with so many things Madiba has said and get requoted, I think it often gets misunderstood and sometimes willfully. So sport has power. Does sport have power to transcend the horrors of an unequal society? The answer is yes, but in a very, very partial way. So you can use sport to rally support. You can use sport to make a difference in people's lives. You can use, as we do at Dreamfields, for example, sport to enrich the educational environment. But if the education in that school is poor, if the children are studying while they're hungry, if the markets and the economy do not create jobs, sport doesn't have the power to change those things. So what we've got to do, in my view, with this World Cup moment is, yes, see it as a moment and an opportunity, but it doesn't fundamentally transform anything. Of course, if you go to the other extreme and say it's irrelevant, that ignores the fact that millions of South Africans celebrated it for a profound and wonderful moment that it was. And I think one of the people who really nailed it was Rassie Erasmus in a very interesting comment when he was talking about what we need to do to build on this World Cup success. He spoke about giving players opportunity to play and all the things you'd expect him to say. And then he mentioned something, he said, and we need to look at nutrition.
Yes.
It doesn't get more profound than that. That if you're growing up without enough to eat and the right things to eat, your chances of being, never mind an elite athlete, but a successful athlete of any kind is small. So sport can do wonderful things. Sport cannot do wonderful things on its own. And if we use the wonder of sport to abdicate our responsibilities to fix the fundamentals of our society, we will have misunderstood and wasted this World Cup opportunity.
Absolutely. Luvuyo, let me bring you in here. As a young person, when you saw Siya Kolisi raising that cup at the World Championships, did you feel that it was something that you can be proud of, that it actually represented a sporting code that was particularly used by Afrikaner nationalism to engender triumphalism and white supremacy? Do you feel comfortable rallying behind Siya Kolisi and the team, or is it just that we like winners?
I see sport as a tool, and I think much like our fellow contributors have spoken to, we need to be mindful of the journey that got Siya Kolisi to that international stage. He made a very poignant point when he said, we did this together. We come from different backgrounds, but we came together in order to solve for this. Now, tuning into that message that we as South Africans can and should come together, regardless of our backgrounds, regardless of where we come from. I think the backdrop of the city of Cape Town speaks to a very, very interesting story around a city that is a key destination for very many tourists.
Yes.
But when you start moving in those very many streets that are represented behind us, you start seeing the segregation.
Yes.
There's certain communities that you still can't drive from a suburb into a township. You have to go into the main highway in order to loop back around. Now, the question is, that is very much a journey of very many sportsmen into one, the very different infrastructures that may be schooling, sporting clubs, and the institutions that actually allow people to get education. We are focusing on the elite athletes, and I think it's all well and good. I sit here as a person who benefited from a basketball scholarship to go overseas. Now, that's another mechanism that we can and should be using sport. It teaches discipline, it teaches teamwork, it teaches resilience, it teaches picking yourself up after failures. There's so many lessons and the mechanism that is the sports field, sports court, all the different sporting fraternities and disciplines are key to teaching people very, very critical skill sets on how to engage with other human beings, how to put your differences aside in order to work together in order to achieve a common goal. Now, the tool that is rugby, I think we as a nation have to work gradually over time to have it be more representative of the demographic that is South Africa. It is doing a great job. It is working in strides, but we all know that there's politics behind certain people getting to certain spaces, and we need to be intentional about that before and in between the very marquee events. Let's not focus on the event and eradicate the journey that every one of those sportsmen and women took to get on that international stage.
Okay, Luvuyo, just hold that thought. I want us to just take a listen quickly to Cyril Ramaphosa, the current president of South Africa, trying to also get into the moment of using that so-called positivity to rally South Africans to our deep structural problems that we have. Let's take a listen to the president shortly after we won the World Cup.
Some people are dismissing this and saying, no, this is not an event that should be seen as consolidating our victory. We say everything that can contribute to nation building, to social cohesion, must be utilized by all of us as South Africans. And it is for that reason that we thank you for being the catalyst that can ensure that we continue to build our nation.
Now, politicians have never been far from sport. They understand the power of sport. Pallo Jordan, what Cyril Ramaphosa is asking us is, of course, to stand together. But South Africa is going through a profound crisis of unemployment. We see our national carrier being involved in a strike. At the moment, the official opposition is discussing electing a new interim leader, with some sections of the party saying race doesn't matter, equating non-racialism to race denialism. Can you bottle that spirit that was there in Japan and say that, politicians want to use it for various national projects that perhaps isn't necessarily in the national interest, but in their own interest?
No, the aspiration of national unity, the aspiration of building a reconciled and united South Africa, I think is a very positive one, and we should encourage that. And I think it's the responsibility of all political leaders to encourage that spirit. It's a very, very, very profound aspiration. Now, we have to, I think, also bear in mind what John Perlman said, that sport is not going to change society fundamentally. You take, for example, the slap in the face Jesse Owens delivered to Hitlerite racism at that Berlin Olympics. It didn't change anything. Those stormtroopers didn't go out and say, we regret having persecuted the Jews. Racism is terrible after Jesse Owens won. It didn't change anything. So we shouldn't expect that from sport. But at the same time, too, we should recognize that because so many millions of people, not only in one's country but throughout the world, watch sport, you can make very, very powerful statements with it. If you think, for instance, about the impact organizing boycotts and etc. against the Springboks before 1994, that had a very profound effect internationally and on white South African opinion. And I remember at the end of that 95 Rugby World Cup, all those white fans standing up and cheering, chanting Mandela's name. Now, that would not have happened if that World Cup hadn't been won that day. They were cheering for very different things from what the people in Yeovil, who stayed up till the small hours of the morning beating drums, were cheering. But, you know, that was a moment that was made possible by that victory in the Rugby World Cup. Equally, this one can be used for the same purposes. And now, it's not opportunistic to aspire to national unity.
Okay, now the point that I'm making, John, is not whether sport doesn't have the capacity to actually unite people around a particular moment and an aspiration. But if you use sport to paper over the cracks that are in society. Like at the moment, what we have is a leadership dearth in many sections of our society. Let's take, for example, the strike at SAA. Yes. SAA is officially bankrupt. We all know that. You need workers and management to actually understand that this is a bankrupt institution, and how are we going to share the pain? Workers are saying, on the one hand, we're not prepared to carry the pain because we don't see management agreeing to cap their executive salaries. We hear management saying, you know, workers are political. They don't want to understand that the strike could very well be the end of SAA. So how do you take that aspiration toward national hope, toward cohesion, and take it and allow that spirit to infuse the negotiations at, you know, a critical time at the national carrier, for example?
Well, I would wish anyone in SAA a great deal of luck if they say, why can't we behave more like the rugby team? To which the workers might answer, well, the coach shows up on time, we get paid our due, we all work together, and when we have a problem, we sort it out. So I think we need to really resist transposing one kind of success onto another. It's a bit like saying, you know, 2 years into a marriage, but we were so happy on our wedding day, why are we fighting now? Certain realities kick in. And one of the realities that I think we need to look squarely in the face if we are to really capitalize on this World Cup moment is to say, what do each of its component parts mean?
Yes.
We celebrate, we enjoy it, we have the trophy tour, that's all fantastic and enjoy it. But then let's interrogate a few things. For example, people can draw one of two kinds of lessons from the Siya Kolisi story. We can say, look how a young black man, despite all the obstacles, managed to rise to the very top. Some people might draw a conclusion from that saying, why don't more young black people defy all the odds and rise to the top? Another way of looking at it is to say what Siya Kolisi had to go through is a disgrace.
Yes.
As a society. So far into a democracy, we make it still so incredibly hard for young black people of talent to rise, whether it's in rugby or business and so on. So, yes, let's take the lessons, but let's interrogate them deeply. And for many people in our society, particularly those who have power and influence, and that includes us, is to do it looking squarely in the mirror.
Luvuyo, this idea that people can just pick themselves up by their bootstraps, that history doesn't matter, that we're all standing at the same finishing line, like the DA often says, we want to create an equal opportunity society, as if all of us are now suddenly equal because we don't have apartheid on the statute books. I mean, that is a false notion. It's not borne out by the lived realities of people. If, for example, you are not eating proper food, your bone density simply won't make you a competitive athlete to compete at the level of a Siya Kolisi. So how does political leadership, business leadership, and society in general take the positivity of sport and put their money where their mouths are instead of just using a ticky-tape parade to make us feel good for 10 minutes?
I think in asking the question, you've answered it, right? It is about all those various different sectors in society coming together, being intentional about doing this work in between the big stages. You cannot say, as a nation, we can be globally competitive if 80% of our population doesn't have access to the amenities that make us globally competitive.
Yeah.
So if corporate sector folds its arms and says government is not giving us an opportunity to do what we will. The question is, what are you doing with your corporate social investment budgets, enterprise and supply development, skills development budgets? It's taken a good 18 years for people to engage these policies intentionally, yet still want to fold their arms and say government is not doing enough. We also have a mindset in our country where we pander towards philanthropy, which says, let me become a multi-millionaire, billionaire first, and then I'll give back.
So let me exploit people first, and then when I have so much money that I can live 5 lifetimes over, I'll give back to the poor.
Now the question becomes, how can you do that intentionally while building? This is not to say don't aim and aspire to be a multi-millionaire, billionaire. How can you do that while empowering people?
Okay.
There's a reality in our economy right now.
Yeah, I want to bring Pallo Jordan in just quickly on that economic point. Pallo Jordan, we're sitting with a national crisis around our economy. We've got over 10 million people unemployed, the majority of that young people. Those young people who ran after the bus, who ran after Siya Kolisi and, you know, aspire to be him. How do political leaders go about fixing South Africa in a concrete manner so that that is not aspirational, so that we don't have to say people need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps? We recognize that all struggles need their mythologies, but surely we should be digging down deep and doing what needs to be done. We can't have pit latrines. We can't have children getting substandard education.
Yes, and to continue the sporting analogy, someone I don't often quote, Lyndon Baines Johnson, spoke in terms of 2 athletes, one with running shoes and one barefooted. And he said that you can't speak of equality between the two if one has running shoes and the other is barefooted. So our policies must aim to give both the runners running shoes. That is what produces equality. Now, how politicians will go about that and how we'll arrive at that, I have my own viewpoint about how we'd arrive at that. Other people have other viewpoints about how we'd arrive at that. But what we agreed on as a nation is that we will solve those problems through discussion, through negotiation, and not by a recourse to violence. So that's what democracy dictates.
John, this question of not solving issues through violence, we've seen simmering protests for over 2 decades in South Africa for access to very basic things like water, electricity, proper sewage, and so on. How long do you think we can keep the lid on those kinds of actions when we have these moments of national joy, whether it's Chad Leclos beating another world record, whether it's the South African netball team that really did well, or our rugby team for other, can those moments really be used by politicians to justify the lack of inaction?
No, and politicians who do that are repeating one of their most common mistakes. Politicians, and particularly those who are in power to change things and run either cities or provinces or national government, would be well advised not to do that and to concentrate on doing their job. The fact that we won the World Cup will not stop people taking to the streets when those streets are filled with sewage. And one of the things they ought to learn from that is that you do not build a World Cup winning rugby team over a weekend or over a couple of months. You do it by careful, detailed work with a lot of self-sacrifice from individuals involved. And I don't see that careful, detailed work and that style of looking at things being applied in key areas of government. I see big announcements where they make an announcement, not that we're going to win the next game, but that we're going to win we're going to win the prize in 4 years' time, and nobody has any idea of how to get there. So no, the problems will arise. The people will take to the streets because they've had enough and they feel that's the only way in which they get noticed. And if people want to be World Cup winners in water and sanitation, they need to realize that just as the rugby team practiced for hours and hours and hours, for weeks and weeks and months and years to get where they got to, the same kind of diligence and absolute understanding that you fix what's in front of you needs to be applied to the taps and the pipes.
Absolutely. Now, let's come to the pipes and the taps, and let's come to the jobs that a lot of young people simply don't have, Luvuyo. What do we require from South Africa's leadership across the board, whether it's from politics to civil society, to be able to harness the enormous talent that actually exists in our country, the fact that we are world-class in many ways? Should we not start off by first just being the best South Africans we can be?
Of course, and I think being the best South Africans we can be, we need to learn from one another. You can't say I'm the best South African without knowing as much about South Africa as possible. And I think in integrating a lot of, in solving this unemployment, job insecurity we currently have in South Africa, you almost have to look at our economy differently, right? It's one directional. Everyone is coming from the townships in to the current urban hubs trying to look for jobs that we all know are dwindling, if not non-existent. The question becomes, how do we cultivate a sense of pride in communities where people can see fixing their communities as part of the job?
Yeah.
And then how do we integrate the government policies that exist that are trying to essentially initiate that work, where corporate then comes in, holds hands with government, and then activates the young people that are in those communities that have the energy, the insights, the expertise within the communities that they come from. We all know that a lot of people's salaries are chewed up coming into these spaces that are the central nodes of economic activity. We also are turning a blind eye that when everyone is in the urban centers looking for work and applying their trade, those communities that are housing a good 80% of our population are sitting dormant with economic activity, with the opportunities being there. So how do we redirect a lot of the programs that we have to be vested in those communities and drive the impact that we can make?
Gentlemen, thank you so very much. This is, of course, a conversation that is ongoing. It's useful to, of course, use sport as some kind of mechanism to tap, where society is at. Pallo Jordan, thank you so much for your time. John Perlman, Luvuyo, thank you for your time. Still ahead, does the African National Congress really need a youth league? Stay tuned.